Speaker. That was a treat. I'm glad I arrived early. It's an interesting mix of facts and fiction. It was kind of peak irony, isn't it, having the member for New England here talking about making foolish statements in the parliament. That's a direct quote. I was listening carefully. The electricity grid is close to collapse, I think you said. We're a dumb country because we don't make cars here anymore. I mean, if only you'd been in government for the last 10 years, you might have been able to do something about this. But what happened to the car industry? Chase them out of Australia? Bye-bye car industry. I think that was your government, member for New England. And the point of a government is to lead, apparently. This is what he told the chamber just there. The point of a government is to lead. If only you'd been in the government for the last 10 years and could have done anything about all of these problems. But I think the favourite bit, I think you walked in, Minister, just as he was explaining to the parliament that it's really not such a dumb idea to bring uranium into the chamber. It's just like a lump of coal and the two are the same and that would be fine. But just when you thought the Libs couldn't get any weirder, even putting aside that contribution from the National Party, they do this. The party of tax cuts is here to oppose a tax cut on electric vehicles. It proves, I think, the point we heard yesterday in question time. A few good points made yesterday in question time. They are really the party of dregs and leftovers from the previous government. And there's a pattern, isn't it, just in the first few months since the election. They refuse to turn up to the Jobs and Skills Summit. They oppose at every turn clean, green, renewable energy to put downwards pressure on power prices. They pretend that secret ministries don't really matter. I mean, if you thought that they were weird, there are the secret ministries, the strangest things since Sir Prince Philip. But this bill to cut tax on electric vehicles is good for motorists, it's good for employers and it's good for climate action. The FBT exemption will apply to battery electric cars, hydrogen fuel cells, plug-in hybrids, and savings of up to $9,000 a year. I think $4,700 if you're buying it as an individual with salary sacrifice or novated leases. And I actually had correspondence about this bill. It was one of the first things in the first sitting week of Parliament. I had Burren Motors locally email me and saying, is this election promise going to happen? When are you going to do it? And I said, well, I've got a good answer for you. We're introducing a bill into the Parliament today. And they said, is it going to pass the Parliament? And I made a mistake. I said to them, well, I'm sure it'll pass the Parliament, because I couldn't imagine a world where the opposition, the party of tax cuts, were going to oppose a tax cut on electric vehicles. But I'm going to have to contact Burren Motors. I visited them a couple of weeks ago to actually have a chat to understand. They got out the schedules, they explained how the novated leases work, they showed me the flow-through calculations, and actually the calculations they had were more optimistic than yours. They said it's going to incentivise employers and consumers to choose electric vehicles. So I apologise publicly for misadvising them, thinking that the opposition might support a tax cut on electric vehicles. But for the last decade, we've had this failing Liberal government actively working to hold Australia back, to stop us embracing the future, running these disingenuous fear campaigns while the rest of the world races ahead. Electric vehicles, according to the former Prime Minister, were going to end the weekend. No one would be able to tow a trailer. And I learnt something again from you, Minister, yesterday in question time, the Deputy Leader of the Liberals, who told the world, told Australians on radio very firmly that there was no firm in the world that manufactures electric utes. Well, that's not true, isn't it? I think, to quote you, there's just a few small boutique firms, weren't they? Small boutique firms of Mitsubishi, Ford and General Motors. Startups, that's right. Anyway, I'm sure she'll walk in and correct herself. But Australians understand far more than the opposition. They understand that electric vehicles are the way forward. But let's be frank, a couple of comments. Australia is currently the dumping ground, disgracefully, for the world's most polluting cars. The multinational car manufacturers, as the member for New England had reminded us, we don't make cars here anymore because the former government chased them away, but the multinational car manufacturers dump their most polluting vehicles in Australia. And that's because we're the only country in the OECD that has no fuel efficiency standards and none under production. Indeed, there's one country, I think, the developed country, which is Russia, that does have, that also has no fuel efficiency standards, but they got kicked out of the OECD. So it's such an illustrious company that we're in. But we are the dumping ground, and too many Australians who are trying to buy an electric vehicle quickly at the moment can't get one quickly. There's not enough supply. We've been left behind because of this low intake, because there's no incentive for the manufacturers to send their cars to Australia. Why would they? They can keep selling polluting vehicles that no one else will buy now in the developed world. So that's the reason that Australians can't get the supply of electric vehicles. Frankly, we're a pimple on the backside of the global car market, and there's no proper incentives for them to increase the supply because we're a small market, we're a right-hand drive market, and as I said, we have the worst vehicle emission standards in the developed world. So just keep on sending them along. It is an illustrious company, isn't it? I think that was possibly your finest moment in question time, net zero. Thank you, Minister. But the hard reality is we are largely irrelevant to the major car manufacturers, especially at the moment with the global supply chain difficulties, which affect everyone, but then compounded by the lack of efficient fuel efficiency standards and our terrible policy settings. Now, the manufacturers won't say it like that. They're very polite people. They'll nod and they'll talk about delays in chips and it's a very tough world out there and we're doing our best, but that is actually the fact. That's what the industry bodies will tell you, that's what the industry analysts will tell you. Doesn't matter how polite they are, until we fix our policy settings and provide some proper incentives for them to change their behaviour and send more electric cars our way, we're not going to get them. Australians are not going to be able to get the clean technology that will cut their fuel bills or remove their fuel bills depending on the technology they choose. That's the cold, hard truth. So we're going to need a range of policy changes to embrace the future and make sure that Australians can access clean technology and electric cars more rapidly. And this bill is therefore one contribution. It's not the whole answer. We had a whole list of problems from the member for New England and opposition speakers as if they weren't the government for the last 10 years. Well, they weren't the government for the last 10 years. They were just kind of parading around in the white cars and occupying the offices. They didn't really do much governing. But more work is needed. And so the electric vehicle discount contained in this bill is just one key part of the government's Powering Australia plan, which will help to reduce emissions targets by 43% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. In addition, this government will continue to provide the infrastructure for electric vehicles in answer to some of the legitimate queries that were raised. The problem is it's all problems, no solutions. They spent 10 years talking down the future, avoiding the future, trying to pretend that's not where the world was going, instead of preparing Australia for the future and bringing us there. So $500 million to the Driving the Nation Fund to establish 117 fast charging stations on highways, an average interval of every 150 kilometres. That should deal with range anxiety, well within the range of all electric vehicles, and creating a national hydrogen highways refuelling network, and also the vehicle emission standards. So in closing, on the vehicle emission standards, they will play an essential role in transforming Australia into a globally competitive market for electric vehicle intake. And Australians are currently paying more for petrol and getting less value for the petrol that they're buying than drivers overseas because we don't have those fuel efficiency standards. Now, we do need to be careful and sensible about how this is done. We've got no choice but to take account of those supply constraints globally and make sure that as we bring in fuel efficiency standards, that the supply of electric vehicles will be available to avoid price shocks. And that's something that the industry bodies are talking to those who are interested in these things about. This can be done, though, and it can be done sensibly, and we don't need to succumb to idiotic scare campaigns like those run by the previous Prime Minister and indeed the now opposition, the dregs of the previous government. Overseas, there's a range of different incentives for manufacturers, and I suppose the only good thing I could say, Deputy Speaker, about the fact that we're last in the developed world, the fact that we're the only country in the OECD not to have fuel efficiency standards, the only positive, if we want to put a positive spin on that, it's that we've got the opportunity to look at what other countries have done to get there in the most efficient way and make our policy settings the best in the world, informed by everyone else's experience, who's got it right and who's got it wrong. So I'm glad that the government is undertaking a proper considered policy process, something alien to the former government, where you just stand up and announce stuff because it sort of feels good and it seemed like a good idea, and you need to have something to fill the daily media cycle. You announce stuff. Doesn't matter whether it makes sense, doesn't matter whether you deliver it, you just announce more stuff. You certainly don't consult on it or write a discussion paper, put it out in public, have a proper process, talk to industry, talk to government departments. Don't do that. Well, that's what we're doing. So I'm delighted that the Minister is running a proper policy process. Adult government is back in the style of Hawke and Keating, governments that ran proper policy processes, expose themselves to criticism. There will be a discussion paper out within the next month or so, I think, and the policy process will continue. Finally, I just want to acknowledge there is strong community support in my area and acknowledge the work of the South East Climate Change Alliance, South East councils right across South East Melbourne who've been advocating for exactly these things that government speakers have been talking about. This bill's good for motorists, good for employers, good for climate action, and I encourage the opposition to get on board.